Looking back, I should have known better. That day felt off from the moment I woke up. The air was heavy and the sun glared a little too brightly through my bedroom window. But 17-year-old me didn't care about ominous feelings. All I cared about was spending time with Evan. We'd been dating for a few months, and every moment with him felt like an escape from the dull predictability of home. It was Evan who brought up the house on Ashwood Lane. We were sitting in his car, parked outside my house, when he mentioned it casually, like we were talking about grabbing ice cream. He'd heard rumors from some older guys at school about the abandoned place at the edge of town. They said it used to belong to a crooked businessman who vanished overnight, leaving behind stacks of cash and secrets buried in the walls. I hesitated. Exploring old buildings wasn't exactly my idea of a romantic afternoon, but Evan had this way of making everything feel exciting. So I agreed, and 20 minutes later, we were pulling up to the property. The house was massive, but it looked sickly. Paint peeled from the siding, and ivy crept over shattered windows. The gate had rusted into permanent stillness, barely hanging onto its hinges. We squeezed through a gap in the fence and walked toward the back door, which hung open just enough to invite us inside. The air inside was stale and thick with dust. We crept through the kitchen, our footsteps echoing faintly on the cracked tiles. There were remnants of someone's life scattered everywhere, faded photographs pinned to the fridge, a coffee mug still sitting in the sink. It felt like walking into a forgotten moment frozen in time. We made our way upstairs to what must have been the master bedroom. The room was huge, with tall windows partially boarded up. An old chandelier hung crookedly from the ceiling, and in the center of the room sat an enormous bed draped in filthy sheets. Evan grinned at me and flopped down on the mattress. "Can you imagine living in a place like this?" he asked. I didn't answer. Something about the silence in that house made it feel like we weren't alone. Then we heard it, a faint voice, almost like a murmur, coming from somewhere nearby. Evan sat up straight, his smile vanishing. "Did you hear that?" I nodded, my throat suddenly dry. The sound came again, this time clearer. It was a man's voice, low and sharp, followed by another voice, angrier, more forceful. We followed the noise down a narrow hallway that led to a slightly ajar door. Evan peeked through the crack, and I watched the color drain from his face. Without thinking, I pushed past him and looked inside. 3 men stood in the room. One of them was tied to a chair, his face swollen and streaked with blood. The other 2 loomed over him, one holding a knife, the other gripping his shoulder tightly. "You think we're stupid?" one of them snarled. "Where's the money, Frank?" The man in the chair shook his head weakly. "I don't have it," he croaked. Evan grabbed my wrist and pulled me back into the hallway. We didn't speak. We didn't breathe. All I could hear was the pounding of my heart in my ears. We retreated to a small linen closet tucked into the corner of the hall, cramming ourselves inside and pulling the door shut as quietly as possible. Through the thin walls, we heard heavy footsteps moving across the wooden floors. "Check upstairs!" one of the men barked. The sound of boots echoed closer. Evan pressed his finger to his lips, but I didn't need the warning. I could barely move, let alone make a sound. The door to the closet rattled slightly as someone paused in front of it. I squeezed my eyes shut, silently begging whatever higher power was listening to keep us hidden. But then, from downstairs, a loud crash reverberated through the house, followed by an angry shout. The footsteps turned away, retreating back down the hall. Evan didn't wait. He pulled the door open, grabbed my hand, and led me back toward the staircase. We moved quickly but carefully, our feet barely making a sound. The men were distracted, shouting at each other over whatever had happened downstairs. We made it to the front door and slipped out into the overgrown yard. Neither of us spoke until we were back in Evan's car, speeding away from Ashwood Lane. The police arrived hours later. My mom forced me to tell them everything, and I did. Every detail except the fact that Evan and I had been sneaking around where we shouldn't have been. The men were eventually caught hiding in a motel outside of town. Apparently, the man tied to the chair was a former associate who double-crossed them. My parents grounded me for weeks after that. They were furious, but I could tell they were relieved too. Evan and I broke up a few months later, though it wasn't because of the house. Sometimes when I'm driving near the edge of town, I pass Ashwood Lane. The house is still there, rotting quietly in its corner of the world. I never stop, and I never look too closely. I know what's waiting behind those boarded-up windows, and I don't want to see it again. Before the next story, if you're new to the channel, make sure to subscribe so that you don't miss any of these terrifying stories. There's a particular kind of arrogance that comes with being a teenager. You feel untouchable, unstoppable, like the world is yours to conquer. That's exactly how I felt the night I decided to explore the abandoned Greenfield Sanatorium by myself. My friends and I used to spend our weekends urban exploring, sneaking into crumbling warehouses and forgotten houses on the edge of town. But after a stupid argument about whose camera gear was better, I told them I'd go on my own next time. And I did. Greenfield had always been on our list, but we'd never gone through with it. Too many rumors, too many warnings. It was an old mental institution, shut down decades ago after a string of scandals and mysterious deaths. Locals said squatters still lived there, and some said it was haunted. None of that mattered to me. I grabbed my camera, a flashlight, and some snacks, then hopped on my bike and pedaled toward the outskirts of town. The building loomed in the moonlight as I approached, its broken windows staring back at me like hollow eyes. The gate was rusted but easy to squeeze through. As soon as I stepped onto the cracked pavement of the courtyard, I felt the weight of the place settle on my chest. It was so quiet I could hear my own breathing, and the air smelled damp and metallic. I made my way through the main entrance. My flashlight cut through the dark, illuminating peeling paint, abandoned gurneys, and broken tiles scattered across the floor. Every step echoed, and the sounds seemed to follow me. I told myself it was just the building settling, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was listening. After about 20 minutes of wandering through the main hallways, I found a staircase leading to the upper floors. The second floor was worse, darker, colder, and more suffocating. My flashlight flickered as I passed empty patient rooms, each one filled with shadows that seemed to stretch toward me. That's when I heard it, a voice, low, almost like a murmur, coming from down the hall. I froze. Every rational part of my brain told me to turn around and leave, but curiosity won. I crept forward, following the sound, until I reached a doorway at the end of the hallway. The door was cracked open just enough for me to peek inside. In the center of the room, illuminated by the faint glow of a single candle, was a man. He was crouched on the floor, rocking back and forth, muttering something I couldn't quite make out. His clothes were filthy, and his hair hung in greasy strands around his face. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. Suddenly, the man stopped rocking and looked up. His eyes met mine through the crack in the door. "Who's there?" he said, his voice sharp and clear now. I jerked back, my heart hammering so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. My flashlight slipped from my hand and hit the floor with a clatter. In the silence that followed, I heard him stand up. I ran. I didn't care where I was going. I just sprinted down the hallway, my shoes slipping on the wet floor. Behind me, I could hear heavy footsteps and the faint sound of muttering growing louder. I turned corner after corner until I stumbled into a small storage closet. I yanked the door shut and crouched in the darkness, my chest heaving with silent sobs. The footsteps came closer. They paused right outside the door. I could hear his breathing, ragged and uneven, just inches away from me. Then, after what felt like hours, they moved on. I stayed in that closet for what must have been another hour, too afraid to move, too afraid to breathe. Eventually, I forced myself to peek out. The hallway was empty. As I crept back toward the stairs, I felt something shift in the air around me, like the building itself was holding its breath. I descended the stairs slowly, every creak of the wood sounding like a gunshot in the silence. When I reached the ground floor, I thought I was safe. But then I saw him, standing just outside the entrance, his silhouette framed by the faint moonlight. "You're not supposed to be here," he said softly. His voice was calm, almost kind, but his eyes gleamed with something I couldn't name. He took a step toward me, and that was all it took. I bolted through a side hallway, stumbling over debris, until I found an emergency exit. It was rusted shut, but I slammed into it with all my strength, and the door groaned open just enough for me to squeeze through. I didn't stop running until I was back on my bike, pedaling so hard my lungs burned. The police showed up at the sanatorium later that night. I told them about the man, about his muttering and the way he stared at me. They found him in one of the old patient rooms, sitting cross-legged in the middle of the floor, surrounded by dozens of burnt-out candles. It turned out he wasn't just some drifter or squatter. He was a patient, one of the last admitted to Greenfield before it closed. He had escaped during its final days, vanishing into the world unnoticed. For decades, he had been living there, convinced he was keeping something terrible, locked inside those walls. I haven't been back to Greenfield since. Sometimes I dream about it, though. I dream about the echo of my footsteps, the cold air in the hallways, and that voice, the low muttering voice that still follows me in my sleep. Before the next story, if you're new to the channel, make sure to subscribe so that you don't miss any of these terrifying stories. When you're 17, fear feels like something you can conquer. That's probably why Chester, Sarah, and I, Antoine, started our YouTube channel, Urban Explorers. It was all about chasing thrills, documenting them, and hoping we'd go viral. At first, it was harmless. Graffiti-covered factories, dusty mansions, places that were more sad than scary. But eventually it got old. No ghosts, no real danger, just us, 3 teenagers pretending we were braver than we were. Then Chester found it. It was buried in some obscure online forum, an abandoned maximum security prison, closed over 30 years ago. But it wasn't the broken bars or decaying cells that caught our attention. It was the stories. Disappearances, strange rituals, and a rumor about something, or someone, still lingering behind those walls. "This is it," Chester had said, practically vibrating with excitement. "This is our viral video." We packed our gear, flashlights, cameras, portable chargers, and drove hours out of town. The prison sat hidden deep in a forest, surrounded by trees so dense they swallowed the sunlight. When we finally arrived, the sight of the place stole the words from my mouth. Massive concrete walls rose into the sky, covered in vines and graffiti. The front gate hung crooked on rusted hinges, like a jaw frozen mid-scream. Chester led the way as usual. "Come on, guys, this is gold." We slipped through a gap in the gate and entered the prison. Inside, it was even worse. The air was stale, thick with mildew, and every step we took echoed down endless corridors. Cells lined the walls on both sides, their rusted bars like the ribs of some forgotten beast. Sarah adjusted her camera, her voice light but strained. "It's a lot bigger than I expected." We wandered deeper into the prison, filming as we went. Every shadow felt sharper, every sound amplified. At one point, Sarah joked, "At least it's empty," but the words sat heavy in the air, like she just said something she shouldn't have. Then we heard it. A sharp clanking sound echoed from somewhere down the hall. "Was that you?" I asked Chester, my voice barely a whisper. He shook his head, his face pale. "Nope." Sarah's camera light wobbled as she turned toward the noise. "Maybe it's an animal?" But animals don't slam steel doors. The 3 of us followed the sound until we reached a cell at the end of a corridor. Its door was slightly ajar, and inside, strange symbols had been scratched into the walls. Faces, spirals, markings that made my skin crawl. The scratches were fresh. "Guys!" Sarah's voice trembled. "Someone's been here, recently." Before we could respond, the cell door slammed shut behind us. I spun around, grabbing the bars and rattling them. "Hey, who's there?" From the shadows of the hallway, figures emerged. Hooded figures, their faces obscured by dark cloth. They stood silently, just beyond the reach of our flashlight beams. "Who are you?" Chester demanded, trying to sound braver than he felt. One of them stepped forward, his hood slightly tilted as if he were smiling beneath it. His voice was calm, almost friendly. "You shouldn't be here." The others moved closer, their silhouettes shifting unnaturally in the dim light. "What do you want from us?" I asked, my voice cracking. "Want?" the hooded man said softly. "Oh, we don't want anything, but they do." I didn't know who or what he meant, but every nerve in my body screamed at me to run. The man gestured, and the cell door creaked open. "Follow us," he said. We didn't have a choice. They led us through winding hallways, deeper into the prison. The further we went, the colder it got. At one point, I swear I saw something move behind one of the cell bars. A flash of pale skin, eyes wide and unblinking. They brought us to a large common area, where flickering candles cast long shadows on the walls. Symbols had been painted across the floor, and in the center sat an old wooden chair. "You want to make your little video, don't you?" the hooded man said, gesturing toward Sarah's trembling hands clutching her camera. "Go on, record. Show them what you've found." Sarah hesitated, her breath coming in sharp gasps. "No?" the man's voice sharpened. "Then perhaps we'll make the choice for you." One of the hooded figures stepped forward, holding a rusted knife. Chester pushed Sarah behind him, his voice cracking as he shouted, "This isn't a game! Please, just let us go!" The man tilted his head, as if considering it. Then, from somewhere deep within the prison, a sound erupted. A long, guttural scream that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. For a split second, the hooded men froze. It was all we needed. "Run!" I shouted. We bolted. Sarah dropped her camera, but none of us stopped to pick it up. We sprinted down hallway after hallway, turning blindly at every intersection. Behind us, we could hear footsteps. Fast, heavy, closing in. Somehow, we found the main entrance again. The door was still ajar, and without hesitation, we burst through it and into the forest. We didn't stop running until we reached the car. Chester fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking so badly he could barely unlock the door. Sarah was sobbing, clutching her chest. When the engine finally roared to life, we sped away, leaving the prison behind. The police didn't find much when they went back. They discovered Sarah's broken camera and some faint traces of candle wax, but no hooded figures, no evidence of what had happened. But we knew. We deleted the channel. None of us wanted to talk about it, let alone show anyone the footage we'd managed to save. Sometimes, though, when I'm alone at night, I hear it again. That deep, guttural scream echoing somewhere far away. And I know I'll never set foot in a place like that again.